Hey guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're going to discuss about the pros and cons of growing Vanda orchids in a home. I think this genus of orchids was the most requested one after the Cattleya video. So as requested, here's the video with the Vandas. If you missed my previous videos on this series, check them down below. I made a pros and cons on Phalaenopsis orchids and Cattleya orchids, so just expand the description if you'd like to watch those videos too. But today, let us focus on the beautiful and wonderful and pretty iconic Vanda orchid. So as per usual, the little disclaimer, these are advantages and disadvantages that I experienced with orchids. They don't necessarily have to be general for 100% of the people. So without further ado, let us start with the pros. And the number one thing that does it for me with Vandas is the wow factor. I was so intrigued by these orchids, flower-wise, but not only, appearance-wise, and how they were sold or how they're grown usually. Being used to stuff like Phalaenopsis, Dendrobiums, Oncidiums made a sort of image in my head of what an orchid should be. Well, when I first saw the Vanda orchid, I thought to myself, what in the world is this jungly appearing plant? Not to mention, my first ever Vanda was the blue flowered one. Well, let's call it indigo flowered one. So I was just blown away. And of course, I was very intrigued to own it. And not only was I very impressed and intrigued with the orchid, my friends or whoever visited my growing space was as well. Even if orchids are completely different from other plants, we still try to grow them somewhat similar. We are very used to having plants in pots in our homes, right? Well, most orchids can be grown in pots as well if we just switch the medium. With the Vanda orchid, we don't even purchase it in a pot. The most popular way of selling Vandas are just bare-rooted in a little black basket that barely contains any of its roots. Sometimes we can find it without that basket as well, and other times we find it completely contained in a glass vase, in a very big glass vase, not only the roots, but the actual plant as well. And you have to agree, that's intriguing. So that's how I first purchased my Vanda orchid, in a very big cylindrical glass vase. Did I keep it like that? No, but for display purposes, that is a fitting display, even if temporary. But these orchids are usually displayed like that, bare-rooted, not potted, in baskets, in glass vases, or just dangling in the air. So for this, it gets the maximum amount of points. The Vanda orchid is wowie. It has roots in the air everywhere that don't sit in medium, and everybody who comes into my grow room, no matter how many Phalaenopsis I have in bloom, they look at the Vandas and they ask myself, are those orchids? And they're supposed to be like that, and those are the roots, and that's how they grow? Yep, wow. So when it comes to Vandas, I think that's the most wonderful thing about them, for me at least, the wow factor. Next up, Vandas have wonderful flowers, and in most cases they are big showy flowers. If you purchase a Vanda hybrid from the flower shop or garden center, most likely you will acquire the Vanda with the very big flowers. They can be indigo blue, pink, even white, even yellow. Typically, the complex hybrids have big, fluffy and showy flowers. If you purchase other types of hybrids or even species, Vandas are pretty diverse. You can have tinier flowers but with beautiful colors and patterns, and even fragrant flowers. There is quite a big diversity when it comes to Vanda orchids and their flowers. They don't all look the same, they don't all have the same patterns and colors, and not even the same shapes or fragrances. Usually the Vandas in flower shops and garden centers don't have a fragrance, but they do have those beautiful flowers. And at least in Europe, the most popular orchid in flower shops when it comes to Vandas is the Vanda Pachera Delight, which has a beautiful indigo flower. But other Vandas might have other types of blooms. And here we go into the more specialized, let's say, part of the hobby. If you are looking for special Vandas or different Vandas, you can go to orchid nurseries and you will find a whole abundance and a whole variety, starting with big blousy flowers that have no fragrance to tiny little sprays of flowers, beautifully fragrant, and even smaller or miniature Vandas. Not all Vandas are super big like this. Usually the hybrids in the flower shops are big, but you can definitely find tiny little Vandas. We call them miniature Vandas, although they're not very tiny, if you don't have a lot of space in your home for them. So when it comes to flowers, they are pretty varied, and they have what I like to call this complete variety, starting with shape, patterns, colors, and fragrances. They don't all look the same. And then comes the orchid. You can have big, wide-looking Vanda orchids, but you can have miniatures as well that don't extend so long in height and in width, and they are perfectly suited for life in a home. Within this genus, there are other Vandaceous types of orchids which don't necessarily bear the name of Vanda, but we can find Ascasendas, Rhynchostylus, Aeridus, and other Vandaceous types of orchids which look pretty similar between them, but they do have their differences in size, appearance, and most important of all, in the appearance of the flowers. So to sum it all up, I consider Vanda orchids to be very, very diverse, and I will call it a complete diversity. The third aspect, which is a major pro for me, is the ease of care. Despite the wild and strange appearance of these orchids, they are actually very easy to grow, very non-finicky, and very well suited for life in a home. Even if they're not potted, they usually can be hung, and if you have a bar on which you can put a drape or a curtain, you can definitely find a little place for a Vanda orchid as well. That's usually how they grow them. If you don't have space on a vertical, you can try on a horizontal in a glass vase, or you can even mount a Vanda orchid. And yes, these are maybe slightly more advanced. If you've just started with a Phalaenopsis, you might find Vandas a little tricky, but overall, once you have just a little bit of experience, you will find Vanda orchids are really, really easy to grow. What makes them so easy, in my opinion, is the love of air and the tolerance of drought. If you don't water a Vanda for a few days, pretty much nothing bad will happen. Watering a Vanda orchid can be a little more tricky, but let's say you have that vase, you can absolutely soak the root system in that vase for 15 minutes to an hour to however much you want, and then leave the orchid with her roots in the air, and it should last you for a few days in normal home conditions. This will depend on the actual conditions, but overall, Vanda orchids don't need to constantly have something around their roots to maintain the moisture like other plants. They're definitely the opposite of your typical terrestrial plant, let's say a pelargonium, right? They are also more drought tolerant than other orchids. They do need their watering, and we'll discuss more in the cons section. But overall, Vanda orchids are really not going to die off on you just because you didn't water them one day. They're also not picky about humidity, and that's one of the things that lacks from a home. If you keep a Vanda orchid very well hydrated, I don't think you should be very worried about humidity. A humidity of 70%, let's say, is really not needed for Vanda orchids. My ideal home humidity is 40%, 30% works as well with Vandas. Other than that, Vandas just require whatever other orchids require, a decent water source. And I know many articles suggest you never use tap water with these orchids, but it really depends on your location. If it's hard water, obviously no orchid will enjoy that. If it's medium and mild water, that should do pretty okay. I've had my Vanda orchids, the very same orchids, for 3 years on tap and for 2 years on osmosis water, and I didn't discover much of a difference. But of course, as I was saying, depends on territory. In some territories, tap water might have some additions like fluoride. I've grown my orchids in tap water of 150 to 180 parts per million that didn't have any other additives except for chlorine, and chlorine was perfectly fine with these orchids. I never had issues. The cleaner the water you can provide, the better, but I wouldn't really go overboard if your water is pretty decent as well. You don't need perfect water, you just need decent water. And the last thing that these orchids need is light. But we'll talk a little bit about it in the cons section. And the last pro that I will talk about is availability. These orchids can actually be found in flower shops and garden centers. Of course, not as often as Phalaenopsis orchids. I'm not entirely sure if there is another orchid as available all the time as Phalaenopsis. But being that flower shops and garden centers only sell orchids in bloom, and that these orchids cannot really be tricked into blooming such as Phalaenopsis, we cannot have a constant supply of Vanda orchids. Phalaenopsis are special in this regard throughout the orchid kingdom. Other orchids, you cannot just trick them like that. Being that Vanda orchids are generally worm-growing types of orchids, as long as they are maintained in a wormed greenhouse over the winter, they can actually bloom throughout the year. And the high hybrids you can find in flower shops do bloom throughout the year 2 or 3 times a year. So every once in a while you will find Vandas in flower shops or garden centers, sometimes quite often, but definitely not all the time. However, you will find them. If you really want a Vanda, you can go to the flower shop and garden centers in many parts of the world and you will find a Vanda. For specific Vanda species or hybrids, you will need to go to a nursery, a specialized nursery. This one can be online as well, you don't necessarily need to be there, and you will find a very big variety at the nursery as well. They will not be in bloom, but they will have tags, so you can Google and see how the flowers look like. There's always availability when it comes to orchid nurseries. You'll find a Vanda, no matter what. Rarely will you see a, let's say, general orchid nursery being out of stock with Vandas. There will be something to choose from. So these are the major pros of the Vanda orchids for me, and now let's make things interesting. Let us discuss about the cons. Now, my major issue with these orchids is price. I think this is the most expensive orchid in the flower shop or garden center. You can find Phalaenopsis orchids for $10, less than $10, a little more maybe. Oh, well, Vanda orchids, especially if they come in that glass vase, they can be even $50/euros. I paid for my very first Vanda, which came in that type of vase, 40 euros. It was a big thing. I didn't just see it and thought, oh, I'm just gonna purchase this because I like it. Oh, no. I planned my purchase and I actually didn't even purchase it until my boyfriend said, you know what, this is a gift from me. I know it's expensive, but I love you. Here you go. I'm going to buy this orchid for you. So it's a little bit of an ordeal to get a Vanda orchid, specifically if it's displayed in the glass vase. If you purchase it bare-rooted, let's say, in a little basket without the glass vase, it's still kind of expensive. It might be 25 euros or 30 euros/dollars, depends. If it's in bloom, it will be the most expensive orchid you will find in the flower shop. If it's not in bloom and the flower shop or garden center decides to sell it at a discount, you can actually buy it at a more decent price. Let's say maybe 15 euros or 20 euros. But again, it's not 3 euros, like you would find a Phalaenopsis which doesn't have blooms anymore. It's quite a big difference. And I'm not sure if this is justified or not. I will go ahead and say it might be, because these orchids are very slow growers. They mature in a lot of time, and because they're not potted and nurseries don't sell them potted, they require a lot of maintenance, a lot of resources in the actual nursery. And by this I mean a lot of water and a lot of fertilizer. You might be tempted to think that these orchids are grown in glass vases in the nursery, but they're actually not. The safest and bestest, let's say, way of growing these orchids in a commercial nursery is by keeping them bare-rooted. They're sprinkled with water maybe once a day, maybe once every 2 days. I'm not entirely sure. Depends on location, most probably. And every time they are watered, most probably they are fertilized as well. One of the roles of the medium with orchids is to retain water and make it available for roots. Also, it retains the fertilizer. So if we don't have anything around the root system to retain water and fertilizer, well, we're just gonna have to fertilize and water a lot more frequent. And that's the case with Vanda orchids, and I'm assuming this is why they are just so much more expensive. However, though, it is a major con. It's not a walk in the park, specifically if you're on a budget. When you see a cool Vanda orchid and it's 50 euros, you will plan that purchase or just give up on the purchase and call it a day. And that's pretty sad, because Vandas are wonderful. The second con with these orchids will have to be that they're not flexible or versatile quite at all. I was telling you that the vast majority of people and nurseries grow these orchids bare-rooted or in a glass vase or in a way which doesn't have medium around the root system. There are a few cases in which these orchids are grown with some sort of medium, but most of the times and for many environments, these orchids really don't do all that great potted with medium, like Phalaenopsis orchids, for example. The roots of these orchids love air, and they're quite sensitive to low oxygen levels. And even if some Vanda orchids can do okay potted, there might be other subspecies that really hate being potted. Also, if a Vanda orchid can survive potted, it usually doesn't bloom as well and doesn't just grow as fast and as nice as a Vanda orchid which is grown bare-rooted in the air with very, very little things impairing airflow. Now this aspect leaves room for exceptions, and one of my experience will have to be semi-hydro with these orchids, but I already have a bad experience with these orchids potted, and I'm a little wary of trying it again. It might end up a failure, and I'm not very willing to just sit back one of my Vandas, but for the sake of experimenting, I'll try it. So because these orchids just love air so much, there aren't many setups for them. You can use a clear pot that you would normally use with other orchids but without medium, and just use the pot as a basket. You can use a basket without medium or with a very, very loose non-water retentive medium such as coconut fiber, or you can use that glass vase if you don't want to hang your orchid and you have a lot of space on your shelf. Bottom line, the most appropriate for most people is the bare root growth. Now that can be a little challenging because we need to water more often. We don't have that medium to retain water. And in a home, that can be problematic. Since most probably we don't have automated systems to do this for us, we need to get the orchid and soak it. Usually that's the best way of watering a Vanda. If you want it to get hydrated, you can soak it in water, and this soak can last 15 minutes if you don't have time, to an hour, to even throughout the night if you don't have too many Vanda orchids, but that will depend on the amount of roots. In any case, watering and maintaining Vanda orchids is really not as easy as maintaining Phalaenopsis orchids, just because they love growing bare-rooted, and that could be a little problem in a home. Third con, space requirements. Vanda orchids, especially the hybrids you find in flower shops and garden centers, are big, big girls. They're a bit of a monster looking like orchid. And not only that, their roots are pretty thick and pretty unruly and long, and if they do great, they actually grow pretty long. That's what we want, long and nice roots on our Vanda orchids. This takes up a lot of space. And not only are the orchids big, all the flowers are big as well, but we don't worry about that. But the way they grow takes up a lot of space as well. A Vanda orchid on a shelf takes a lot of space. Reason why many people decide to just keep them hanging. And the best place in a home is next to your curtain, on the bar that holds your curtain or your drape. And well, this again can pose a few problems with the space. Where are you actually going to hang it in that window? How many orchids can you fit in that window? 2, 3? Well, it depends on the size. So pretty much the size of this orchid and its growth pattern will pose quite a few problems. And a little related to that, because of the roots, because they're just so big, when we water these orchids, we need to let them drip very well. Otherwise, they will drip on our carpet, and I'm not sure if that's what we want. Also, they can drip on our furniture, and that's definitely not what we want. So the way they grow, their size and everything screams not suited for homes. And I'm not sure if they're exactly suited for a home, but we can improvise a little bit. However, it's just going to be tricky or just an ordeal in some cases. We really should want the orchid if we're gonna go through the ordeal of finding a place in our home for it. Another con with these orchids, and I'm not sure about the number of the con, is the quantity of light they require. Yes, they're not finicky orchids. They will not mind low humidity, they will not mind a low drought, but they will mind shade. These are the orchids with the highest light requirements. Most Vandas. There are only a few Vandas which don't require as much light. They can do very well in oncidium light, but growing a Vanda in Phalaenopsis medium to low light will result in a non-blooming Vanda orchid in most cases. Vandas generally require direct sunshine, either filtered through a sheer curtain or a shading cloth, either direct as it is, but not in the noon, not when it can overheat the leaves. Other than that, the more bright light you can provide to this orchid throughout the year, the better. Now, in a home, this can be a little problematic. Yes, it's ideal if you can grow these orchids in front of your curtain hanging on the bar, but if your window doesn't face south, west, or even east, then you have a problem. North-facing windows are really not suited for Vandas. Eastern windows can work, southern windows are the best, western windows can work as well. Depends what type of influence you have from the other direction. So these were the pros and cons of Vanda orchids. I will just mention one more detail that is neither here nor there. I'm not even sure if it's a pro or a con. These are warm-growing orchids, and they're not really all that happy in low temperatures. In a home, It might be okay if you like to maintain your home rather warm. If you don't like to maintain it warmish but rather coolish, it might be a little problematic with these Vandas, particularly the big ones or the complex hybrids in flower shops. And yeah, that can be a good thing or a bad thing. I don't find it either a con, either a pro. Alrighty guys, so these have been my pros and cons. If you have your own, do put them in a comment down below, because some of my viewers said that these videos are actually very helpful and they would like opinions of people and myself regarding orchids growing in a home, which will help them decide if they want to purchase something or not. So you know the drill. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!